December 1944. Versailles, just outside Paris. Inside a dimly lit war room, the air feels heavier than the winter pressing against the windows. Maps of Western Europe stretch across long tables, creased, marked, rewritten again and again as the front line crawls toward Germany. Colored pins crowd the Ardennes, the Rhine, the Ruhr. Every inch of ground now carries a cost measured in fuel, time, and lives. At the center stands Dwight D. Eisenhower. His posture is steady, his expression controlled, but the strain is visible in the quiet pauses between his words. For months, he has balanced not just armies, but personalities, holding together a fragile alliance under constant pressure. Across from him, Bernard Montgomery remains firm, precise, unwavering. His argument is familiar now. Concentrate the forces. One powerful thrust. Drive north. End the war quickly. The room is silent, but the disagreement is not new. It has been building through victories, setbacks, and missed opportunities. And on this cold December day, something begins to shift. Because this time, Eisenhower does not simply listen. June 1944 had opened a door that could never be closed again. On the shores of Normandy, beneath gray skies and relentless fire, Allied forces forced their way into occupied Europe during the Normandy landings. It was not just an invasion. It was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany's control in the West. But success on the beaches was only the first step. What followed would test not only armies, but the structure of Allied command itself. At the center of that structure stood Dwight D. Eisenhower, appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. His role extended far beyond battlefield decisions. He was responsible for holding together a coalition of nations, primarily the United States and Britain, each with its own priorities, pressures, and expectations. Every decision had to balance military necessity with political consequence. Under him served Bernard Montgomery, one of Britain's most experienced and confident commanders. Montgomery had been given command of the ground forces during the initial stages of the invasion. Methodical and deliberate, he believed in overwhelming strength applied at a single decisive point. His approach favored preparation, concentration, and control. In the early weeks after Normandy, this structure functioned with visible success. The Allied foothold expanded slowly but steadily. German resistance was fierce, especially in the dense hedgerows of the Norman countryside, where every field became a fortified position. Progress was measured not in miles, but in fields taken at heavy cost. Yet beneath the surface, differences in doctrine were already taking shape. Eisenhower viewed the campaign in broad terms. His strategy, later known as the Broad Front, called for continuous pressure along a wide line. The goal was to stretch German defenses, deny them the ability to concentrate forces, and advance steadily across multiple sectors. It was a strategy built not on speed, but on sustained pressure. Montgomery saw it differently. He believed that the war could be shortened through a single, concentrated thrust. Rather than advancing everywhere, he argued for prioritizing one powerful attack, breaking through German lines and driving deep into the heart of Germany. To him, dispersing strength across a wide front diluted the Allies' advantage. These were not minor disagreements. They reflected fundamentally different philosophies of warfare. As July turned to August, the situation on the ground began to change rapidly. The stalemate in Normandy broke with the success of Operation Cobra, allowing American forces to push through German lines and into open terrain. The front, once static and confined, suddenly became fluid. German units began to retreat, often in disarray. Paris was liberated in late August 1944, a symbolic and strategic victory that sent a clear message. The Allies were no longer contained. They were advancing. But with speed came new problems. The rapid advance across France stretched supply lines to their limits. Fuel, ammunition, food, everything had to travel from the beaches of Normandy across hundreds of miles of damaged roads and congested routes. The faster the armies moved, the more fragile their logistical support became. And in that growing strain, strategic disagreements sharpened. Montgomery began pressing more firmly for priority. If supplies were limited, and they were, then they should not be spread thin. They should be concentrated behind a single thrust, under unified command, aimed directly at Germany's industrial heartland. In his view, this was the fastest path to victory. Eisenhower resisted. He understood the risks of concentrating too heavily in one sector. A single thrust, if stalled or countered, could expose the entire Allied advance. A broad front, though slower, offered flexibility. It ensured that pressure remained constant, preventing the Germans from regrouping effectively. Behind these decisions stood not just military logic, but national expectation. Britain, having endured years of war, sought decisive action. The United States, with its vast resources and growing presence in Europe, favored sustained momentum across all fronts. Eisenhower had to navigate both. By early September 1944, the Allied armies stood at the borders of Germany. The war seemed closer to its end than ever before. But the closer they came, the more complex the decisions became. Because now, every choice, where to attack, who to supply, which plan to follow, would shape not just the next battle, but the final outcome of the war. And the differences between Eisenhower and Montgomery were no longer theoretical. They were becoming operational realities, waiting for a moment to collide. By September 1944, the Allied advance had outrun its own momentum. From the beaches of Normandy to the borders of Germany, the pace had been faster than anyone had predicted. But speed had come at cost. Supply lines, already strained, were now stretched across hundreds of miles of damaged infrastructure. Trucks carried fuel over roads still scarred by retreating German forces. Rail networks were only partially restored. Every gallon of gasoline, every artillery shell had to travel farther than the last. And there was never enough. In this tightening reality, strategy could no longer be separated from logistics. It was no longer simply a question of where to attack, but who would receive the resources to do so. At the center of this growing dilemma stood Bernard Montgomery, increasingly convinced that the moment demanded decisive concentration. He argued that the war in the West could be brought to a rapid conclusion if the Allies committed fully to a single, powerful thrust into northern Germany. His proposal was clear: prioritize his forces, direct supplies north, and drive across the Rhine in one coordinated push. To Montgomery, the situation was an opportunity. German forces were retreating, disorganized, and vulnerable. A concentrated blow, delivered quickly, might collapse their defensive structure before they could recover. But to Dwight D., Eisenhower, the same situation appeared far more fragile. He saw an advancing front that was dangerously overextended. German resistance, though weakened, had not disappeared. Units were regrouping along natural defensive lines, particularly near the German border. Intelligence reports warned that the enemy was still capable of mounting counterattacks. Committing too heavily in one direction risked leaving other sectors exposed. The disagreement sharpened into a defining decision. Montgomery's vision took form in a bold and ambitious plan, Operation Market Garden. It would combine airborne and ground forces in a coordinated effort to seize a series of bridges in the Netherlands. The objective was clear: secure a direct route across the Rhine, bypass German defenses, and open a corridor into the heart of Germany. It was, in many ways, the purest expression of his strategic philosophy. The plan called for airborne divisions to land deep behind enemy lines, capturing key bridges before they could be destroyed. Ground forces would then advance rapidly along a narrow corridor, linking with the airborne troops and continuing the push forward. If successful, it could outflank the German defensive network entirely. Eisenhower approved the operation, but not without hesitation. He did so within the framework of his broader strategy, not as a full shift toward Montgomery's preferred approach. Resources were allocated, but not exclusively. Other Allied forces continued to advance along the wider front, maintaining pressure across multiple sectors. The result was a compromise, and like many compromises in war, it carried risks. When Market Garden began in mid-September 1944, it opened with initial success. Airborne landings achieved several early objectives. Bridges were captured. The corridor began to form. But the deeper the operation pushed, the stronger the German resistance became. Unexpected concentrations of German armored units, particularly near Arnhem, challenged the advancing forces. The narrow corridor proved difficult to secure. Supply and communication lines were vulnerable. Delays began to compound. What had been envisioned as a rapid breakthrough slowed, then stalled. At Arnhem, the final and most critical bridge remained out of reach. The airborne forces there, isolated and outnumbered, held their positions as long as they could. But without reinforcement, the outcome became inevitable. Operation Market Garden failed to achieve its primary objective. The consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. For Montgomery, it was a setback that did not change his fundamental belief in concentrated force, but it weakened the immediate case for exclusive priority. For Eisenhower, it reinforced the risks he had anticipated. A single thrust, even a well-planned one, could falter under unexpected resistance. Meanwhile, the broader front continued to advance, but slowly. German forces, though battered, began to stabilize their defenses along the Siegfried Line. The Allied momentum, once rapid and fluid, encountered renewed resistance. Progress became measured again, deliberate, costly. Behind the front lines, the pressure did not ease. Supply shortages persisted. Command disagreements continued. Political expectations remained high. Winston Churchill maintained his interest in bold, decisive action, often aligning with Montgomery's vision. American leadership, meanwhile, supported Eisenhower's broader approach, emphasizing sustained pressure and flexibility. The alliance held, but it was under strain, because now the debate was no longer about possibility. It was about proof. One strategy had been tested and had fallen short. The other continued, but without the swift victory many had hoped for. And in the quiet spaces between meetings, reports, and battlefield updates, the tension between two commanders, two visions of victory, continued to build, waiting, once again, for the moment when it could no longer be contained. The conflict between Dwight D, Eisenhower, and Bernard Montgomery was never defined by a single argument. It was shaped by layers of personality, doctrine, and the invisible weight carried by men responsible for millions of lives. To understand why tension in that December war room reached its breaking point, it must be seen from multiple angles, each revealing a different pressure building beneath the surface. Eisenhower commanded not just armies, but an alliance. His authority rested on balance between nations, between egos, between competing visions of victory. He rarely raised his voice. He listened, absorbed, negotiated. His strength lay in restraint. Decisions were not forced. They were built slowly through consensus. But that strength came with limits. Because across the table stood Montgomery, a commander who did not operate within quiet compromise. He was precise, confident, and unwavering in his conclusions. When he believed he was right, he did not soften the argument. He reinforced it. Montgomery's leadership style was direct, almost rigid. He sought clarity, simplicity, and control. In his mind, war could be reduced to decisive principles. Concentrate force, strike hard, finish the fight. He did not see the need to dilute strength across multiple fronts when one powerful blow might end the war. Where Eisenhower saw complexity, Montgomery saw clarity. Where Eisenhower managed, Montgomery asserted. These differences did not always create conflict, but under pressure, they made agreement harder to reach. Each conversation became less about finding common ground and more about defending a position. And over time, even patience begins to erode. At the heart of their disagreement was a fundamental question. How do you end a war that is already turning in your favor? Eisenhower's broad front strategy aimed to apply continuous pressure across the entire Western Front. It ensured that German forces could not regroup or concentrate their defenses effectively. If one sector slowed, another could advance. It was flexible, resilient, and designed to absorb uncertainty. But it was not fast. Montgomery's vision offered speed, at least in theory. By concentrating Allied strength into a single, powerful thrust, he believed the front could be broken open entirely. A direct advance across the Rhine, aimed at Germany's industrial core, might collapse the enemy's ability to resist. It was a strategy built on decisive action, not gradual pressure. Yet war rarely follows theory. The failure of Operation Market Garden had exposed the risks of that approach. Even a carefully planned, concentrated assault could falter when faced with unexpected resistance, fragile supply lines, and limited flexibility. Still, Montgomery did not abandon the concept. To him, the failure was not in the idea, but in its execution and the lack of full commitment. Had resources been fully prioritized, had the thrust been stronger, he believed the outcome might have been different. Eisenhower drew a different conclusion. For him, the operation confirmed the danger of narrowing focus too tightly. The war in Europe was too complex, too fluid, to depend on a single line of advance. Strength had to be distributed, even if it meant slower progress. The divide remained, not because one man misunderstood the other, but because both understood the stakes too clearly. Beyond maps and strategies, there was something less visible, but just as powerful: fatigue. By late 1944, the war in Western Europe had been relentless. Months of continuous operations had worn down not only soldiers at the front, but the commanders behind them. Decisions were no longer made in moments of clarity. They were made under pressure with incomplete information and constant urgency. Every report carried weight. Every delay had consequences. Every disagreement mattered. Eisenhower carried the burden of unity. If the alliance fractured even slightly, the entire campaign could weaken. He had to consider not only what was militarily sound, but what would keep British and American forces aligned. Montgomery carried a different weight. He believed, firmly, that a faster end to the war was possible. And with that belief came urgency. Every day spent advancing slowly, every opportunity not seized, was another day the war continued. Neither perspective was wrong, but together they created friction. Because when exhaustion meets conviction, compromise becomes harder to reach. And as the winter of 1944 approached, that exhaustion deepened. German resistance was stiffening along the Siegfried Line. Supply problems persisted. The promise of a quick end to the war had faded into a slower, more uncertain reality. Inside the war rooms, the tone of discussions began to change. Less patience, less flexibility, more urgency. And in that environment, even measured disagreement could begin to feel like opposition. The arguments were no longer isolated. They were interconnected. Leadership, strategy, human strain, all tightening around the same central question. How should the war be finished? And more importantly, who would decide? By late 1944, the disagreement between Dwight D. Eisenhower and Bernard Montgomery was no longer contained within strategy papers or formal meetings. It had begun to reflect something larger, pressures that extended beyond the battlefield, shaped by politics, logistics, and the unpredictable behavior of an enemy that refused to collapse as expected. The Allied command was never a single, unified voice. Behind every major decision stood governments, expectations, and national pride. Britain and the United States, though aligned in purpose, carried different perspectives shaped by their wartime experiences. For Britain, the war had begun years earlier. It had endured isolation, sustained bombing, and prolonged strain. By 1944, there was a growing desire for decisive action, an end that justified the years of sacrifice. Winston Churchill often favored bold operations, seeing in them not just military value, but political and psychological impact. Montgomery's approach resonated with that vision. A single, powerful thrust into Germany offered the possibility of a clear, dramatic conclusion. It was a plan that could be understood, communicated, and supported at the highest levels. The United States approached the situation differently. With greater industrial capacity and expanding forces in Europe, American leadership favored sustained, overwhelming pressure. Rather than risking everything on a single advance, they supported Eisenhower's broader strategy, one that leveraged their numerical and logistical strength across multiple fronts. Eisenhower stood between these positions. Every decision he made had to satisfy not only military logic, but the expectations of Allied governments. Supporting Montgomery too heavily risked alienating American commanders. Rejecting him outright risked political tension with Britain. So the balance was maintained, but never comfortably. On paper, strategy defines direction. In reality, logistics defines possibility. By the end of 1944, the Allied advance was limited less by enemy resistance than by the ability to sustain momentum. Fuel shortages became critical. Armored divisions, capable of rapid breakthroughs, were often forced to slow, not because of opposition, but because supply lines could not keep pace. The ports of Normandy were no longer sufficient for the scale of operations underway. The capture and opening of Antwerp offered hope, but access to the port was delayed by German control of surrounding areas. Until those approaches were cleared, the supply crisis remained unresolved. Every commander understood the implication. There was not enough fuel, not enough transport capacity, not enough immediate supply to fully support all offensives at once, which brought the argument back into focus. Montgomery insisted that this limitation strengthened his case. If resources were scarce, then they should be concentrated. A single, well-supplied thrust would achieve more than multiple undersupplied advances. Eisenhower saw the same limitation as a reason for caution. Concentration meant risk. If that single thrust stalled, due to weather, resistance, or unexpected factors, the Allies would lose both momentum and flexibility. A broad front ensured that no single failure would halt the entire advance. He believed, firmly, that a faster end to the war was possible. And with that belief came urgency. Every day spent advancing slowly, every opportunity not seized, was another day the war continued. Neither perspective was wrong, but together they created friction. Because when exhaustion meets conviction, compromise becomes harder to reach. And as the winter of 1944 approached, that exhaustion deepened. German resistance was stiffening along the Siegfried Line. Supply problems persisted. The promise of a quick end to the war had faded into a slower, more uncertain reality. Inside the war rooms, the tone of discussions began to change. Less patience, less flexibility, more urgency. And in that environment, even measured disagreement could begin to feel like opposition. The arguments were no longer isolated. They were interconnected. Leadership, strategy, human strain, all tightening around the same central question. How should the war be finished? And more importantly, who would decide? By late 1944, the disagreement between Dwight D. Eisenhower and Bernard Montgomery was no longer contained within strategy papers or formal meetings. It had begun to reflect something larger, pressures that extended beyond the battlefield, shaped by politics, logistics, and the unpredictable behavior of an enemy that refused to collapse as expected. The Allied command was never a single, unified voice. Behind every major decision stood governments, expectations, and national pride. Britain and the United States, though aligned in purpose, carried different perspectives shaped by their wartime experiences. For Britain, the war had begun years earlier. It had endured isolation, sustained bombing, and prolonged strain. By 1944, there was a growing desire for decisive action, an end that justified the years of sacrifice. Winston Churchill often favored bold operations, seeing in them not just military value, but political and psychological impact. Montgomery's approach resonated with that vision. A single, powerful thrust into Germany offered the possibility of a clear, dramatic conclusion. It was a plan that could be understood, communicated, and supported at the highest levels. The United States approached the situation differently. With greater industrial capacity and expanding forces in Europe, American leadership favored sustained, overwhelming pressure. Rather than risking everything on a single advance, they supported Eisenhower's broader strategy, one that leveraged their numerical and logistical strength across multiple fronts. Eisenhower stood between these positions. Every decision he made had to satisfy not only military logic, but the expectations of Allied governments. Supporting Montgomery too heavily risked alienating American commanders. Rejecting him outright risked political tension with Britain. So the balance was maintained, but never comfortably. On paper, strategy defines direction. In reality, logistics defines possibility. By the end of 1944, the Allied advance was limited less by enemy resistance than by the ability to sustain momentum. Fuel shortages became critical. Armored divisions, capable of rapid breakthroughs, were often forced to slow, not because of opposition, but because supply lines could not keep pace. The ports of Normandy were no longer sufficient for the scale of operations underway. The capture and opening of Antwerp offered hope, but access to the port was delayed by German control of surrounding areas. Until those approaches were cleared, the supply crisis remained unresolved. Every commander understood the implication. There was not enough fuel, not enough transport capacity, not enough immediate supply to fully support all offensives at once, which brought the argument back into focus. Montgomery insisted that this limitation strengthened his case. If resources were scarce, then they should be concentrated. A single, well-supplied thrust would achieve more than multiple undersupplied advances. Eisenhower saw the same limitation as a reason for caution. Concentration meant risk. If that single thrust stalled, due to weather, resistance, or unexpected factors, the Allies would lose both momentum and flexibility. A broad front ensured that no single failure would halt the entire advance. December 1944 did not begin with certainty. Across the Western Front, Allied forces pressed forward, but without the speed that had once defined their advance. The optimism that followed the liberation of France had settled into something more cautious. Progress continued, but it was measured. Every mile required coordination, supply, and time. Inside headquarters near Versailles, the war was being fought in a different way. Large maps covered entire walls, layered with color markers showing divisions, supply routes, and defensive lines. Reports arrived constantly. Fuel shortages, troop movements, weather conditions, intelligence summaries. Each one added detail, but none provided clarity on how the war would end. At the center of it all stood Dwight D, Eisenhower. His role demanded more than command. It required control of strategy, of coordination, of an alliance that could not afford division. Yet the pressures surrounding him had grown heavier with each passing week. Across the Channel, expectations remained high. In London, Winston Churchill continued to support bold, decisive action. In Washington, confidence rested in sustained momentum and the gradual exhaustion of German resistance. Between them, Eisenhower had to maintain balance, without allowing the campaign to fracture. But balance was becoming harder to hold, because Bernard Montgomery had not changed his position. If anything, he had strengthened it. In meetings, memoranda, and direct communication, Montgomery continued to press for priority. His argument remained consistent. Concentrate resources, focus on the northern sector, and deliver a decisive thrust into Germany. The limitations of supply, in his view, made this not just preferable, but necessary. The tone of these requests had begun to shift. What had once been proposals were now firm recommendations. What had once been debated now carried an edge of insistence. Montgomery did not see himself as challenging authority. He saw himself as advocating the most effective path to victory. But repetition has its own weight. Each time the argument returned, it placed pressure on Eisenhower's position. To grant full priority would mean altering the entire structure of the Allied advance, redirecting fuel, divisions, and operational focus toward a single axis. It would also mean accepting the risk that came with such concentration. To refuse, however, required justification, not just to Montgomery, but to the broader alliance. The discussions grew longer. Staff officers presented data, fuel consumption rates, transportation capacity, projected timelines. Intelligence briefings outlined German defensive positions along the Siegfried Line. Weather reports hinted at worsening winter conditions, complicating any large-scale movement. Still, the central question remained unresolved. Where should the weight of the Allied advance fall? Montgomery's proposals were clear in structure. A narrow front, heavily supplied, pushing through northern Germany. A direct path toward key industrial regions. A concentrated effort that, if successful, might shorten the war significantly. Eisenhower's position remained broader. Maintain pressure along the entire front. Advance where possible. Prevent the Germans from consolidating their defenses. Use flexibility to respond to changing conditions. It was a strategy that absorbed uncertainty, but did not eliminate it. Between these two approaches lay no simple compromise. And so the conversations continued, measured, professional, controlled. But beneath that control, tension was building, because time was no longer an abstract factor. Winter was setting in. Conditions on the front were deteriorating. Movement slowed. Supply challenges deepened. The expectation of a swift conclusion to the war had faded, replaced by the reality of continued resistance. Then came the reports from the Ardennes. At first, they were fragmented, unclear. Movements detected, increased radioactivity, indications that German forces were repositioning in a sector long considered quiet. It was unexpected. The Ardennes, heavily forested and difficult terrain, had not been seen as a likely location for a major offensive. Allied forces there were relatively thin, resting, reorganizing, preparing for future operations. But the reports continued, and they became more urgent. German units were not just repositioning. They were assembling. Inside the war room, the atmosphere shifted. The focus of every discussion changed. Maps were updated. Intelligence officers re-evaluated their assessments. The possibility that had seemed unlikely began to take shape with increasing clarity. A counteroffensive, not a local action, not a limited attack, something larger. In that moment, the ongoing strategic debate, broad front versus narrow thrust, did not disappear, but was interrupted, because now the Allies were no longer deciding how to advance. They were preparing to respond. And as the scale of the German movement became clearer, the pressure inside the command structure intensified even further. Decisions would have to be made quickly. Priorities would have to shift. And the balance that Eisenhower had maintained for months would be tested under entirely new conditions. The arguments had not been resolved. They had only been delayed. And as the situation in the Ardennes began to unfold, the moment approached when delay would no longer be possible. On December 16, 1944, the uncertainty ended. Before dawn, German artillery opened fire across the Ardennes. A massive barrage, concentrated and deliberate, shattered the quiet sector that Allied command had considered stable. Within hours, armored columns moved forward through the dense forests, exploiting gaps in the line. It was the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge. For Dwight D, Eisenhower, the situation changed instantly. What had been a strategic debate was now a crisis. The German offensive was not limited. It was deep, coordinated, and aimed at splitting the Allied front. Key roads were cut. Units were isolated. Communication lines faltered under pressure. Inside headquarters, the war room no longer carried quiet tension. It carried urgency. Reports arrived faster than they could be fully processed. Some contradicted each other. Others revealed the scale of the attack. German forces pushing west, aiming toward Antwerp, attempting to divide British and American armies. The implications were immediate. If successful, the offensive could disrupt the entire Allied advance. Eisenhower's role shifted in that moment, from balancing strategy to enforcing control. There was no time for extended debate, no space for competing long-term visions. The situation demanded coordination, speed, and clarity. Yet even within this crisis, the underlying tension remained. Bernard Montgomery, commanding forces in the northern sector, was now positioned in a critical role. As the German advance created a bulge in the Allied line, the front effectively split into northern and southern commands. Communication between these sectors became increasingly difficult. Eisenhower made a decisive move. He temporarily placed American forces north of the German penetration under Montgomery's operational command. It was a practical decision based on geography and communication, but it carried weight. Authority, even temporary, had shifted. Montgomery now held responsibility for stabilizing the northern flank. At the same time, Eisenhower directed forces in the south, coordinating a response designed to contain and then counter the German advance. The priority was no longer theoretical. It was immediate. Hold the line, prevent further penetration, and regain control of key positions. The war room, once divided by strategic philosophy, now operated under necessity. Orders were issued rapidly. Reinforcements were redirected. Air support, limited by weather, was prepared for deployment when conditions allowed. Supply lines, already strained, were adjusted to support defensive operations rather than continued advance. In this environment, Montgomery continued to advocate clarity and concentration. His approach to the crisis reflected his broader philosophy. Stabilize the line, organize forces, prepare for a deliberate, controlled counterattack. He emphasized structure, ensuring that units under his command were positioned effectively before attempting to push forward. But the tone of his communication began to draw attention. Public statements, delivered with confidence, suggested a level of control and success that did not fully reflect the broader Allied effort. While the northern sector was stabilizing, American forces in the south were bearing the weight of intense fighting, holding positions under severe pressure. To Eisenhower, this was not simply a matter of perception. It was a matter of unity. The alliance could not afford divisions, public or internal, especially in the midst of a major German offensive. Every action, every statement had to reinforce coordination, not undermine it. And here, the tension returned, sharper than before, because now the disagreement was no longer about future strategy. It was about present reality. Montgomery's continued emphasis on controlled, prioritized action, combined with his communication style, began to strain the balance Eisenhower had worked to maintain. The temporary command arrangement, though necessary, added complexity. Authority had to be exercised carefully, without disrupting the cohesion of the Allied command structure. Inside the war room, discussions became more direct. Eisenhower, known for patience, began to assert his position with greater clarity. Decisions were no longer framed as options, they were directives. Coordination across all sectors took priority over individual approaches. The breaking point was not a single outburst. It was a shift, a moment when restraint gave way to firmness. Eisenhower made it clear that the strategy of the Allied campaign would remain unified. No single commander would dictate the direction of the war. Resources would be allocated according to the needs of the entire front, not concentrated based on individual proposals. Montgomery would continue to play a critical role, but within the structure defined by Supreme Command. The message was understood, not through raised voices, but through the clarity of command. As December turned toward January, the German offensive began to lose momentum. Allied resistance held. Reinforcements arrived. Air power, once the weather cleared, returned to the battlefield with decisive effect. The bulge in the line began to contract. What had started as a surprise attack became a costly failure for Germany. But inside the Allied command, something had changed. The balance between cooperation and control had been redefined. Eisenhower had not abandoned diplomacy, but he had reinforced authority. And Montgomery, though still influential, now operated within clearer limits. The war would continue. The advance into Germany would resume. But the question of who shaped that advance had been answered, not in theory, but in action. The battlefield had stabilized. The alliance had held. But the cost of both, in strain, in tension, in decision, would carry forward into the final phase of the war. By early 1945, the frozen ground of Western Europe told a different story than the maps inside Allied headquarters. The German offensive in the Ardennes had failed to achieve its strategic objective. What began as a surprise thrust in December 1944 had been gradually contained, then pushed back under sustained Allied pressure. The battered German formations, stretched thin and low on fuel, could not maintain momentum against reinforced Allied lines. For Dwight D. Eisenhower, the outcome carried both relief and consequence. Relief because the Allied front had held under one of the most significant surprises of the Western campaign. Consequence because the crisis had forced a restructuring of command clarity that could not be undone. During the emergency, coordination had tightened. Orders had been simplified. Decision-making had become more centralized. And while this allowed the Allies to respond effectively, it also reinforced a new reality. Unity of command would now take precedence over competing operational visions. In the northern sector, Bernard Montgomery had played a critical role in stabilizing the front. His forces absorbed pressure, reorganized defensive positions, and contributed to halting German advances toward key logistical routes. But the operational environment had shifted. The temporary command arrangements introduced during the crisis were gradually withdrawn. Control returned to the broader Allied structure, where Eisenhower resumed full coordination of all fronts. Montgomery remained one of the most experienced field commanders in Europe, but the scope of his independent operational influence had narrowed. This was not announced as a confrontation. It emerged through procedure. Orders flowed through revised channels. Strategic priorities were redistributed. The emphasis moved decisively toward a unified push into Germany, rather than sector-driven initiatives. Behind these adjustments was a simple reality. The war was entering its final phase, and fragmentation of command carried more risk than advantage. On the ground, Allied forces began regrouping. Supply lines that had been strained through the winter were gradually stabilized. The port of Antwerp, finally secured and operational, became a critical logistical hub. Fuel and ammunition flows improved significantly, allowing armored formations to regain mobility. With resources restored, planning shifted toward the next objective, crossing into Germany itself. The failure of the Ardennes offensive had exhausted one of Germany's last major strategic reserves in the West. Armored divisions were depleted. Experienced units had been lost or scattered. The ability to mount large-scale counteroffensives was diminishing. Yet resistance remained. Along the Siegfried Line, German forces still held fortified positions. Concrete bunkers, anti-tank defenses, and entrenched infantry created a barrier that would require careful, sustained operations to overcome. Allied commanders understood that the war was not yet finished, but it was moving toward its final shape. Politically, the alliance remained intact. The cooperation between American and British forces continued without rupture, though the strain of months of disagreement had left its mark. Differences in approach had not disappeared. They had been absorbed into the structure of command. Eisenhower's role, reinforced by the Ardennes crisis, had become more defined than ever, not just as coordinator, but as final arbiter of strategy. Montgomery, while still influential and respected, operated increasingly within a framework where broader Allied priorities determined direction. Neither outcome was dramatic, but both were decisive. Because in coalition warfare, control is rarely taken. It is established through necessity. As winter gave way to early spring, Allied forces prepared for the final advance into Germany. The Rhine stood ahead as the last major natural barrier before the German heartland. The war, once defined by debates over strategy, was now defined by execution. And the disagreements that had once filled war rooms were slowly being replaced by a single focus: ending the conflict. By March 1945, the Western Front had shifted into its final, irreversible phase. The German army, once stretched across occupied Europe, now fought a defensive war inside its own shrinking territory. Along the Rhine, the last major natural barrier in the West, preparations for Allied crossing intensified. Engineering units built bridges. Artillery positioned itself for sustained bombardment, and air power maintained pressure over retreating German formations. For the Allies, momentum had returned, but it was now structured, deliberate, and overwhelming. Under the unified command of Dwight D. Eisenhower, the strategy that had long defined the campaign was fully realized. Pressure across multiple fronts, preventing German concentration while steadily advancing into the heart of the Reich. The crossing of the Rhine marked a turning point not because it was unexpected, but because it confirmed what the previous months had already established. German capacity to resist at scale was collapsing. Armored divisions surged into central Germany. Infantry units advanced through towns that, only months earlier, had been part of a fortified defensive system. Resistance remained, but it was increasingly fragmented, lacking coordination and reserves. In this final phase, the disagreements that had once defined Allied command, particularly between Eisenhower and Bernard Montgomery, faded into operational history rather than present tension. Montgomery continued to command forces in the northern sector during the advance into Germany. His armies crossed the Rhine and pushed into northern industrial regions, contributing significantly to the encirclement of German forces in the Ruhr. His preference for concentrated action found partial expression in localized operations, but always within the framework of overall Allied coordination. Eisenhower's role, however, had become unmistakably central. He was no longer balancing competing strategies. He was directing a single coordinated advance across the entire Western Front. Decisions were no longer about reconciling divergent visions. They were about maintaining tempo, logistics, and unity as the campaign moved toward its conclusion. The internal friction that had once been so visible in war rooms was not erased, but it had been absorbed by outcome. The collapse of German defensive capability accelerated through April 1945. Encirclements in the Ruhr pocket trapped large numbers of German troops. Supply shortages became critical. Command structures deteriorated. Units surrendered in increasing numbers as organized resistance broke down. The Allied advance continued deeper into Germany, reaching cities that had once formed the core of the Third Reich's industrial and political system. By this stage, the war in the West was no longer a question of strategy. It was a question of surrender timing. The consequences of the Ardennes offensive also became clearer in retrospect. What had been Germany's final major attempt to alter the course of the Western Front had failed at immense cost. The loss of armored reserves, fuel, and experienced personnel accelerated the overall collapse of German resistance. Allied intelligence assessments later confirmed that the offensive had not only failed strategically, but had also weakened Germany's ability to defend its western territory in the final months of the war. Inside Allied command, reflections were more restrained. There was no single moment of victory attributed to any one strategy or commander. Instead, the outcome was understood as the result of sustained pressure, logistical superiority, and the ability to adapt under crisis. The tensions between Eisenhower and Montgomery, though significant during the campaign, did not define the final result. Instead, they became part of a larger operational reality, one in which differing approaches were ultimately constrained by necessity and unified by outcome. By late April 1945, Allied forces had reached the Elbe River. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. Germany's territorial integrity had effectively disintegrated. The war in Europe was approaching its final conclusion, and as Allied units consolidated their positions deep inside Germany, the earlier disputes over concentration versus broad advance had already been answered, not in theory, but in results. What remained was not disagreement. It was closure. By the spring of 1945, the Western Front had stopped being a debate about strategy and become a record of outcomes. The tensions between Dwight D, Eisenhower, and Bernard Montgomery, once visible in every major decision, every allocation of force, every disagreement over direction, had been absorbed into the larger reality of victory in Europe. What remained, in hindsight, was not a single correct doctrine of war, but a demonstration of constraint under pressure. Eisenhower's broad front strategy reflected the demands of coalition warfare. Multiple nations, multiple armies, and the necessity of maintaining unity even when opinions diverged. It was not the fastest path in theory, but it was the most stable in practice, designed to prevent collapse at any single point of failure. Montgomery's preference for concentrated force reflected a different truth of warfare, that decisive pressure, applied at the right point, can break systems faster than gradual attrition. His approach found moments of validation, particularly in localized operations and rapid breakthroughs, but it existed within the limits of logistics and alliance structure. Between these two approaches stood the reality of the war itself. Supply lines that stretched across continents, weather that halted offensives, intelligence that arrived incomplete, enemy forces that adapted rather than simply collapsed, and above all, an alliance that had to function as a single instrument despite differing national priorities and command philosophies. The conflict between the two commanders was never purely personal. It was structural. It reflected the deeper challenge of modern coalition warfare, where success depends not only on force, but on coordination between systems that do not always think alike. In the end, the Allied advance into Germany succeeded not because one vision defeated the other, but because both were constrained by a shared objective, ending the war. And when the fighting finally stopped in Europe, what remained was a transformed understanding of command itself, not as dominance of one idea over another, but as the ability to hold competing ideas together long enough to achieve victory. The war room debates faded, the maps changed, and history moved forward.